The orange glow of streetlights shimmered against the puddles gathered on the streets of an industrial district on the outskirts of Rotterdam. Bram, seated in the cab of his truck, let out a deep sigh, feeling the weight of long hours on the road and the oppressive silence that often accompanied his solitary routine. He pulled over near a small rest area, surrounded by piles of rusting metal containers and large sacks of rubbish emitting a pungent odor. It was a typical spot for a quick break, but tonight, something unusual caught his attention. As he turned off the engine, a faint sound, a metallic creaking, as if something was being moved, made Bram frown. He glanced around but saw no one. The noise persisted. Curiosity piqued, he stepped out of the truck and walked towards a large rubbish container, the apparent source of the sound. The container swayed slightly, as though something, or someone, was inside. With cautious hands, Bram pushed up the metal lid and leaned in to look. What he saw left him speechless. A small girl, with wide eyes and disheveled blonde hair, was curled up amongst the rubbish bags. She clutched a piece of moldy bread with both hands, her expression a blend of fear and fierce determination. Bram froze, trying to process the stark contrast between the child's fragility and the harshness of her surroundings. When the girl realized she'd been discovered, she retreated further into the container, like a cornered animal. "Hey, it's all right. I'm not going to hurt you," Bram said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. His voice was low and gentle, careful not to frighten her any more than she already was. The girl didn't reply. She simply stared at him, her eyes glistening with a mix of distrust and exhaustion. She seemed so fragile, almost unreal, as if a gust of wind might shatter her. "Are you alone?" Bram asked again, kneeling beside the container to meet her eye level. "You don't have to be afraid. I just want to help." After a long pause, the girl shook her head, indicating she wasn't alone, though she said nothing more. Bram noticed she was trembling, not just from the cold, but perhaps from hunger or fear. Quickly, he returned to his truck and grabbed a bottle of water and a packet of biscuits from his cab. When he came back, he held the items out towards her. "Here, take this. You need to eat." She hesitated, her wary eyes darting between him and the food. Eventually, she took it. The sound of the plastic wrapper being torn and the crunch of biscuits as she devoured them were the only noises to break the heavy silence for a few minutes. Slowly, the tension in her face began to ease. "What's your name?" Bram asked softly, watching her. "Sofie," she replied, her voice so faint it was barely audible, yet clear enough for Bram to hear. "Sofie, where's your family? Are you hurt?" She shook her head again, this time looking down at the ground. After a few more moments of hesitation, she murmured, "My mum, she's sick. Really sick." The words hit Bram like a blow. He didn't know what had driven this little girl to hide in a rubbish container, but he was certain the situation was far worse than it appeared. Instinctively, he felt a deep need to protect her, even without knowing her full story. "It's all right, Sofie. We'll figure this out together," he said firmly. "I'm going to help you, but first, we need to get out of here. It's too cold, and you need somewhere safe to rest. Do you trust me?" Sofie studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. It was a start. Gently, Bram helped her out of the container and guided her to the truck. As she settled into the passenger seat, the stench of grime and neglect filled the cab, screaming the urgency of the situation. Bram knew his roadside break was over, but more importantly, he realized his life was about to change forever. As the truck's engine roared back to life, Bram couldn't shake the weight of Sofie's words, "My mum is sick." He needed to uncover what was happening, but something deep inside told him this was only the beginning of a much larger story. The truck's engine hummed softly as Bram drove along the rain-slicked roads towards Gouda. In the passenger seat, Sofie sat quietly, hugging her knees and clutching the nearly empty biscuit packet. The faint glow of the dashboard cast light on her dirt-streaked face, etched with exhaustion. Despite her initial wariness, there was a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes, a spark that Bram was determined to keep alive. The light rain drummed against the windscreen, its rhythmic patter filling the silence between them. Bram glanced at the girl, searching for the right words. He wasn't much of a talker, but he knew he needed to break the ice if he was to understand her situation. "Do you live near Rotterdam?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Sofie hesitated, as though weighing every word carefully, as if speaking the wrong thing could have consequences. By a canal. The house is old. My mum, she can't leave. Bram felt a pang in his chest. The fragility in Sofie's voice was striking, but even more unsettling was the weight of what she left unsaid. He decided not to push her, at least not yet. You're safe now, he reassured her. We're going to my house. There's real food, a warm bath, and clean clothes. Then we'll figure things out, all right? Sofie cast him a wary glance, but there was something in her eyes, perhaps relief, that made her nod faintly. She turned back to the window, watching the distant city lights flicker through the rainy night. When they arrived at Bram's home, a modest house in a quiet village near Gouda, he helped Sofie out of the truck. The house was small but cozy, furnished simply, with the faint aroma of burning wood drifting from the fireplace. It's okay. Come in, Bram said, holding the door open. Sofie entered cautiously, her footsteps hesitant on the wooden floor. The first thing Bram did was heat some soup. While she ate, he prepared a warm bath and found some old clothes from when his niece used to visit. Watching her take small sips of soup and eat slowly tugged at his heart. He couldn't help but wonder how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. After the bath, now dressed in clean clothes, Sofie looked less fearful, though the exhaustion still weighed heavily on her. Bram pulled up a chair and sat near her. Sofie, he began gently, I need to understand. You mentioned your mum. Is she very ill? She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. We can't buy medicine. She coughs all the time. She can barely get out of bed. And what do you have to eat? Nothing. That's why I went looking for food today. Her voice trembled, and she lowered her head, ashamed. Bram took a deep breath, the gravity of her words settling over him. He couldn't leave them like this. To help Sofie's mum, Maria, he needed to see their living conditions for himself. Here's what we'll do, Bram said softly. Tomorrow morning, you'll take me to your house. We'll sort this out together, all right? Sofie hesitated, then nodded, a faint glimmer of trust returning to her eyes. As she slept on a makeshift mattress on the sofa, Bram sat by the fireplace, staring into the glowing embers. He had no idea how deep this situation would take him, but his mind was made up, he would do whatever it took. The next morning, as the sun began to break through the grey clouds, Bram knew there was no turning back. Sofie's words echoed in his mind, we'll sort this out together. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the reality awaiting him at her home would be far worse than he imagined. The sun was still low on the horizon when Bram and Sofie left his home in Gouda. He helped her climb into the truck, handing her a coat to shield against the morning chill. Though Sofie remained wary, there was a noticeable shift, she seemed more willing to trust him. As the truck rumbled along winding roads, she gave directions, describing the route to the house she shared with her mother. As they neared their destination, the scenery began to change. The peaceful vistas of villages and open fields gave way to cramped, neglected streets lined with crumbling buildings that seemed on the verge of collapse. Bram felt a knot form in his stomach as he turned into a narrow alley by a canal. This is it, Sofie said, pointing to a brick house with boarded-up windows and cracks in the walls. Bram parked the truck and helped Sofie down. The air was thick with the stench of mold and stagnant water. As they approached the front door, its hinges groaned in protest, revealing an interior more dismal than Bram had imagined. The house was dark, damp, and cold. Worn, mismatched furniture filled the small space. In one corner of the living room lay an old mattress covered with thin blankets, and on it was a woman who seemed trapped in a restless sleep. Mum! Sofie cried, rushing to her side and dropping to her knees. Bram followed, carefully observing Maria. She was young, likely in her early 30s, but the illness had aged her considerably. Her pale skin, chapped lips, and labored breathing painted a grim picture. Slowly, she opened her eyes, her gaze dull but wary at the sight of Bram. Who are you? Maria asked, her voice weak and hoarse. My name's Bram, he replied, kneeling beside her. I found Sofie last night. She was out looking for food. Maria tried to sit up, but a violent coughing fit left her collapsed back on the mattress. Bram steadied her and handed her a bottle of water. "Why would you help us?" she asked between coughs, her tone laced with suspicion. "Because it's the right thing to do." "I won't leave you like this," Bram said firmly. As Maria caught her breath, Bram glanced around the room. The house was in dire condition, cracks ran along the walls, the heater was broken, and there was little evidence of food or medicine. The neglect was unmistakable, but it spoke more to desperation than indifference. "Sofie told me you're unwell," Bram began gently. "How long has this been going on?" Maria hesitated, then admitted, "Months. I can't afford a doctor, let alone medicine. And I can't work. I don't know what else to do." Her words hit Bram like a punch to the gut. Anger flared within him, not at Maria, but at the system that had allowed 2 lives to spiral into such despair. "I'm getting you out of here. I'll take you to a doctor, and we'll sort this house out," he declared with determination. Maria shook her head, a mix of disbelief and gratitude flickering in her eyes. "It's not that simple. I know it's not simple. But it's necessary. And I'll find a way." Bram knew he couldn't fix everything on his own, but neither could he afford to wait for the sluggish gears of social services. He made a few calls right there in the house, only to be met with bureaucratic responses and empty promises of assistance. Frustration gave way to steely resolve. Stepping outside to clear his head, he inhaled the crisp canal air. Behind him, Sofie stood in the doorway, her eyes silently pleading for hope. Bram realized conventional methods wouldn't be enough. As he gazed at the misty horizon, a painful decision crystallized in his mind: to save Maria and Sofie, he would have to revisit the past he'd worked so hard to leave behind. Bram gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts swirling like the smoke from ships drifting along Rotterdam's canals. He knew the conventional path to help Maria and Sofie would take far too long. Bureaucracy had already shown its cold, unyielding face, and Maria didn't have the luxury of time. It was clear, he needed to take a different route, even if it was fraught with risks. His destination was now Amsterdam, a city that stirred memories of a past he'd worked hard to bury. In his younger days, Bram had been entangled with people who lived on society's edge, none more notable than Koen, a man whose rise in the criminal underworld had been both rapid and perilous. Bram had severed ties with that world long ago, but today, he found himself needing to rekindle them. The drive to Amsterdam was quiet. Sofie had been left in the care of a trusted neighbor, while Bram set off on what felt like the most daunting mission of his life. As he entered the bustling city, its lively streets were a stark contrast to the silence in his mind, where his thoughts churned, fixated on the risky decision he was about to make. Koen greeted him in a dimly lit warehouse, surrounded by stacked crates and shadowy figures lingering in silence like living phantoms. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but Koen smiled upon seeing Bram, a smile that carried both nostalgia and a hint of menace. "Bram! I never thought I'd see you again," Koen said, stepping forward with a firm handshake. "What brings you back?" "I need a favor," Bram replied bluntly, skipping pleasantries. Koen raised an eyebrow and lit a cigarette, scrutinizing Bram with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "It's been years since you left the game. And now you show up asking for a favor? That's intriguing." Bram wasted no time explaining Maria and Sofie's plight, holding nothing back. Koen listened silently, his face unreadable. When Bram finished, Koen took a long drag on his cigarette before speaking. "You've got a good heart, Bram. But favors like this? They come with a price." "I know. I'll pay," Bram said, steadying his voice despite the tension tightening his chest. "All right," Koen said with a sly grin. "I'll lend you the money. But remember, I'm not a charity. I expect repayment, with interest." The last word landed like a hammer blow, heavy with implied threats. Bram agreed, knowing he had no other choice. Koen handed him an envelope containing enough cash to cover Maria's medical costs and provide for basic necessities. As Bram left the warehouse, the weight of the deal bore down on his shoulders. He had stepped into a dangerous game, but he knew it was the only way to save Maria and Sofie. Driving back, the envelope securely tucked away, Bram couldn't silence the question echoing in his mind, how far will I have to go to keep my promise? He knew that Maria's surgery would be just the beginning of an even more perilous journey. The grey skies over The Hague mirrored the tension gripping Bram's heart. He drove swiftly but cautiously, the envelope of money securely tucked into his coat pocket. Beside him, Maria reclined in the passenger seat, wrapped in a thin blanket. Her pallor and occasional cough were evident signs of her fragility, yet there was something new in her expression, a faint spark of hope he hadn't seen before. In the back seat, Sofie held her mother's hand tightly, as if her presence alone could shield Maria from harm. Bram had wasted no time. As soon as he returned from Amsterdam, he made all the necessary calls to ensure Maria was admitted to a hospital in The Hague. The money from Koen had opened doors that had once seemed firmly shut. A local doctor had recommended a specialist, and Bram had managed to secure an emergency appointment, which, by sheer luck, included the possibility of immediate surgery. The hospital loomed ahead, a modern building with glass and concrete facades. For Maria, it was intimidating. For Bram, it was a beacon of hope. He helped Maria out of the truck, steadying her as Sofie clung to his coat like a lifeline. Inside, the admission process was surprisingly quick. Bram handed over the documents he had painstakingly gathered and paid the advance fees without hesitation. He watched as Maria was taken to the triage room, leaving him and Sofie alone in the waiting area. Sofie looked adrift, her eyes scanning the bustling hallway and the rows of chairs. Bram pulled a chair closer and knelt beside her. "Everything will be all right, Sofie. They're going to take care of your mum," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Do you promise?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Bram paused for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her trust. "I promise to do everything I can to make sure she gets better." Hours crawled by. Sofie eventually fell asleep on a bench, while Bram stayed awake, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Finally, a doctor approached, his expression tired but reassuring. The surgery was successful. "Maria is stable, but she'll need intensive care and time to recover," the doctor said. Relief flooded through Bram, though the burden of responsibility still lingered. He thanked the doctor and went to see Maria in her room. When he saw her lying in bed, still weak but breathing steadily, a sense of calm washed over him. He knew the road ahead would be long, but this was a beginning. The next day, Bram returned to the hospital with Sofie. For the first time in months, Maria and Sofie shared a moment of peace. Maria's expression as she saw her daughter was one of pure emotion, and Sofie, holding her mother's hand, seemed lighter, almost free of the weight she had carried. As Bram watched them, he realized how fragile their bond was and how much it depended on the decisions he would have to make. Yet the shadow of his debt to Koen loomed over him. The deadline to repay the loan was approaching, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. As they left the hospital, Bram felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out to read a message from Koen, "We meet tomorrow. Don't disappoint me." The chilling words confirmed what Bram feared, the debt was about to come due. To protect Maria and Sofie's future, he would have to confront dangers far greater than anything he had faced so far. The night was dark as Bram parked his truck at an abandoned dock on the outskirts of Amsterdam. The sound of water lapping against the wooden pillars was drowned out by the weight of the tension he carried. Meeting Koen was not optional, and Bram knew the debt he had taken on to save Maria and Sofie now demanded repayment. But he didn't have the means to pay, not in the way Koen expected. Koen was already there, leaning against a gleaming black car, flanked by two hulking men whose stern expressions left no room for doubt. The air was heavy, and every step Bram took on the wet asphalt seemed to echo louder than it should. As he approached, he forced himself to remain calm, though he could feel the piercing stares of the men following his every move. "Bram," Koen began, lighting a cigarette and exhaling the first puff to the side, "you know I'm not a patient man. I trust you came prepared." Bram drew a deep breath, the cold night air cutting through his skin. "Koen, I need more time. I can't pay it all back yet, but I'm working on it." Koen raised an eyebrow, his laugh dry and disbelieving as he shook his head. "More time? That wasn't part of the deal. You knew the terms when you agreed." The two men stepped forward, their imposing presence increasing the pressure. Bram knew this wouldn't end well unless he acted quickly. He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Listen, Koen. I'm not here to back out. I just need you to trust me one more time. I did this for a family on the brink of death, a mother and a child. I know you understand what it means to protect your own. Koen stared at Bram for a long moment, his face hardening. Protect my own? Don't preach morality to me, Bram. In my world, it's pay or pay. One of the men took another step closer, clearly following instructions to intimidate. Bram realized he had to play his last card. If you want to take me down, go ahead, Bram said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. But I'm more valuable to you alive. I know routes, contacts, things that could make your work more efficient. Let me help you expand, in exchange for time to pay off the debt. The silence that followed was unbearable. Koen studied Bram, the cigarette burning slowly between his fingers, before breaking into an unexpected laugh. You've got guts, Bram. I like that. But know this is your last chance. Fail me, and I'll take what's mine. He crushed the cigarette under his shoe. We have a deal. Bram nodded, fully aware he had only delayed the inevitable. As he returned to his truck, the weight of the agreement pressed heavily on his shoulders. In the days that followed, Maria continued her recovery in the hospital, and Sofie started attending school with Bram's help. But every delivery Bram made and every contact he mediated for Koen was a stark reminder of the precarious tightrope he was walking. The situation reached its breaking point when one of the shipments Bram transported for Koen was intercepted by port authorities. Bram hadn't known there was anything illegal in the cargo, but the discovery left him vulnerable. Koen accused him of betrayal, sending men to pressure him into immediate repayment. Cornered and threatened, Bram realized he couldn't keep living like this. He needed a definitive solution, something that would free him, Maria, and Sofie from this dangerous web. Desperation drove him to seek help from an unlikely source, a childhood friend who had become a police officer in Rotterdam. Initially reluctant, the friend agreed to help after hearing Bram's full story. Together, they devised a plan. If Bram could gather enough evidence to incriminate Koen, the authorities could shut down his operation and offer Bram protection. It was a risky move, but Bram knew it was the only way to secure their safety. Over the next few days, he discreetly collected information, recording conversations and noting details that could serve as evidence. On the night of the final meeting with Koen, Bram handed everything over to the authorities before heading to the warehouse for the showdown. He knew he was walking into the lion's den, but this time, he wasn't alone. As Koen demanded repayment, the warehouse doors burst open, and police swarmed in, arresting everyone present. Koen's face contorted with a mix of fury and surprise as his empire crumbled before his eyes. He locked eyes with Bram, his expression burning with anger, but Bram stood his ground, knowing he had made the right choice. Watching Koen being led away in handcuffs, Bram felt an immense weight lift from his shoulders. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. He had to face the aftermath of his decisions and rebuild a life for himself, Maria, and Sofie. The road ahead would not be easy, but as he left the warehouse, Bram made a silent vow: their future would be free from shadows, built on a foundation of hope and second chances. Winter was giving way to spring, and the grey skies of the Netherlands now felt less oppressive. Bram parked his truck in front of a small house on the outskirts of Utrecht. It was a modest home, but welcoming, with freshly painted windows and a small garden beginning to bloom. At the door, Maria and Sofie waved to him as he turned off the engine. Since Koen's arrest, life had started to stabilize. The authorities, recognizing the significance of Bram's cooperation, provided him and his newfound family with protection. Though challenges remained, the shadow of danger had finally lifted, allowing them to build a new life. Maria, now fully recovered, had found work as a seamstress at a local cooperative. She approached her job with dedication, grateful for the second chance she had been given. Sofie, meanwhile, was attending school for the first time in months. The once weary child now wore a frequent smile, especially when she ran to embrace Bram at the end of his day. "You're just in time," Maria called as Bram approached the door. "Sofie wants to show you the drawing she made at school today." Sofie came running, holding a piece of paper like a prized possession. It was a simple drawing, yet deeply meaningful: a truck, a house, and 3 figures holding hands under a bright blue sky. "It's our family," Sofie explained, her eyes shining. Bram knelt down to examine the drawing more closely. His throat tightened, but he managed a smile, gently ruffling her hair. "It's perfect. You're an artist." Later that evening, as the 3 of them shared dinner at the table, Bram looked at Maria and Sofie, reflecting on everything they had endured. The greatest lesson of his life was sitting right there with him. "I think I've learned something from you both," Bram said, his voice steady but laden with emotion. Maria and Sofie watched him intently. "When I helped Sofie that night, I thought I was just doing the right thing. But saving you also saved me. It showed me that even in the worst situations, kindness is always worth it." Maria smiled, placing her hand over his. "Sometimes, the courage to do what's right comes before the reward." Sofie, still clutching her drawing, added with a child's innocence, "And now we're together. That's what matters, isn't it?" Bram nodded. He had faced adversity, danger, and hard choices, but now, under the grey sky, he understood that true wealth lay in the strength of human connections. As night fell, Bram looked at Maria and Sofie, knowing they had finally found the home they had longed for, a home built on courage, resilience, and love. If you made it to the end of this heartwarming story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with your loved ones. Your support is essential for us to keep bringing amazing stories like this one.